now it's
I think it's us.
yes, that's right. So I hand it over to you and let you go ahead.
Thank you,
Please.
Shell. So yeah, time for the QAH session, Quality Assessment for Health Application. So Raphael, can you share your screen, please?
Okay. Can you see it yet? No. Okay. And now?
I can't.
Not yet. Just
No.
a bit.
Or if you prefer, I can share the.
Is it on yet?
Yeah.
Okay.
Good.
So.
Margaret, do you have something to say? I saw you raise your hand. Maybe not. Okay.
No, that was not intentional. Sorry.
All right. Okay. No worries. No worries. So yeah, thank you everyone for attending the QH session. So I will start quickly by a little reminder of what we did this year. So I'm sorry for those who were here on Monday because it will sound a bit similar. So Raphael, could you please move on to
I'm
next?
trying. I am trying. Doesn't appear to be working. Don't know why.
Maybe you can just put the normal slides mode if it's any easier. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, with the QH group, so we published a review paper in July on subjective quality assessment for medical imaging. So Margaret, very sorry we didn't answer your email where you asked us about medical databases for the norm session, which was Tuesday. So we will make sure to collect the existing data sets, even though there are not many. We only found 3 so far. We will make sure to gather them and send them to you a bit late, a bit too late for the norm session, but at least you will have them soon. So I will do that with Lou and Miriam ASAP. So yeah, in this paper we mentioned about the subjective quality assessment and task-based approach for medical imaging. Next, Raphael. Thank you. And so thanks to your effort, we managed to submit our special session to ICIP to 2022. So for those who were with us on Monday, you might remember that we were still looking for 3 abstracts to submit our special session by Monday evening. And so we got our 6 abstracts. So that's the good news of the day. So we will know early January whether our special session is accepted or not. And if it is, please consider to submit your papers to our session at ICIP 2022, which will be held in Bordeaux, France, in October. And the third thing we worked on as a QH group is a new topical review submitted to medical image analysis last Monday, which will be presented by Raphael right now.
Okay. Thank you, Lucy. Hello, everyone. I don't know if this is okay for you. I can't seem to use my controls to pass the slides in the presentation mode. So if that's okay for you, I'll just keep it as it is so that we can move along. So my name is Rafael Rodrigues. I am a researcher at the Instituto de Telecomunicações and also a PhD candidate at UBI in Portugal. And I co-authored this new survey paper titled Objective Quality Assessments of Medical Images and Videos review and challenges alongside with 9 other active QEG members, namely Lucy Levesque, Jesus Gutierrez, Huda Yebari, Meriam Utas, Lu Zhang, Aladdin Shetwani, Shaima Al-Jubori, Maria Martini, and Antonio Pinheiro. So in total, 6 different institutions were involved in co-writing this survey paper, which was recently submitted to medical image analysis. Medical image and video are often subject to a lot of impairments that arise from the acquisition and reconstruction of the images and the videos. And these impairments are often specific to each imaging modality. Other than that, we can also have context-related factors. For example, the motion of the patient, for example. And furthermore, these images and videos may also be subject to processing, compressing, transmission, and visualization methods, which would also have an impact on the end quality of the signal. Measuring the quality of images and videos in medical applications is a priority, a necessity towards improving methods for the clinical workflow. But it is also a very challenging field, given the diversity of the content, the diversity of impairments, and also the applications. Another important factor regarding medical imaging is that the quality perception by end users is likely to be more influenced by their diagnostic and clinical utility rather than merely aesthetic criteria, as is the case with most natural content. So in this paper, we proposed to divide the objective quality methods into 2 main categories. As Lucy said, there was a recent review on subjective quality assessment published earlier this year in Physics in Medicine and Biology. So we decided to focus on what's not been done so recently, which are objective quality assessment methods for medical image and video. There was a review paper published by Chao and Parameshran in 2016. In that paper, the authors focused both on subjective and objective quality, and also they focused mainly on magnetic resonance imaging. So we think that this is a more comprehensive and more up-to-date review on these kinds of methods. So inside the objective quality assessment methods, we proposed a division into visual quality-based approaches, which refer, let's say, to the more typical approach to image and video quality assessments. These methods compute a quality index directly from visual and structural information of the content. And then we also consider task-based approaches, which are designed to approximate the performance of a task by a human observer. These types of methods will be discussed more in depth in a presentation by Lu Zhang after this one. As I said, visual quality-based in the sense of this paper, as we categorize them, they approach the typical methods of measuring quality in image and video. And we also have a division into these 3 categories, which are full reference methods and reduced reference metrics, which imply the presence of a reference image or video, which is assumed to have a pristine quality or at least no perceived distortions that might affect the final quality. And then the no reference metrics, which don't require the use of such a reference content. Just a quick recap on what we have done. So this is the number of references separated by the imaging modalities inside the visual quality-based methods. So as we can see, most of the papers used MRI images, and also a lot of papers used retinal image and ultrasound. This is not on the slides, but I have the information here. So 13 of the papers that we reviewed were related to full reference methods. 4 papers talked about reduced reference methods, and most of them were older papers, and 20 papers talked about no reference methods. Moving on into the task-based quality assessment methods, we subdivided them into the specific tasks that the methods rely on to assess the quality of the images and videos. So we have detection and classification. We have estimation tasks, localization, segmentation, and characterization tasks. In this paper, although we have these 5 possible subdivisions with maybe surgery tasks as well, we also were able to found research efforts on detection and classification, localization, and segmentation. The same here for the task-based methods. So fewer papers were found for this review paper, but these are more recent papers. So task-based methods have been increasingly used in the past years. So as you can see, 4 papers used phantom studies, and another 4 papers used computer simulated images. We will discuss this in the next slides. So not a lot of papers, for example, with MRI or ultrasound, as was to be expected. In this paper, we also aimed at, besides summarizing the papers that we reviewed, we also aimed at providing a discussion on the potential limitations and also identifying some possible challenges for the future work. From our analysis, we could see that regarding the quality-based full reference and reduced reference metrics, I have a repetition there, sorry. All the reviewed papers reported the use of metrics that were originally developed for natural content. So in 10 studies, we could find the use of PSNR and SSIM, for example. And apart from that, VIF and NQM were also used very frequently. Inside the full reference metrics, we could only find 1 paper that reported a metric that was specifically designed for medical content. That is a paper by Razak and Martini in 2016, which proposed a metric that relied on cardiac motion to produce a quality index from a reference. As for the no reference metrics, most papers proposed metrics that were developed for the specific content that was considered. Also, we could see that the use of deep learning methods is becoming a staple in the no reference quality assessments of medical image and video, as the most recent studies used convolutional neural networks instead of using handcrafted features. So, moreover, we could see that there is a lack of subjective annotated quality databases for to be used in the validation of objective metrics. So we have here three examples of papers that report such databases. The paper by Suad et al. In 2013, Utas et al. In 2018, and Khan et al. More recently in 2020. As for the task-based quality assessment methods, we discussed in the paper that the annotated datasets should in the future incorporate models of how the clinicians perform the diagnosis from those images and videos, for example. That is something that is currently lacking. In order to address these issues, there was a suggestion, for example, of using human-in-the-loop machine learning. Indeed, the artificial intelligence techniques promise strong breakthrough in medical imaging objective QA. Moving on, another challenge that we found for the objective medical quality assessments has to do with artifact simulation. So collecting data with real artifacts is often impractical and time-consuming and may not always be possible. However, the simulated artifacts that were used in these studies are normally limited in their range. So most of them use, for example, Rician noise or Gaussian noise. And this may hinder the application of these methods to real clinical data. There were some recent efforts reported concerning the simulation of content-specific and more realistic artifacts, which can be found in these papers. You have the references below. And also, we discussed that the use of deep learning methods, for example, using generative adversarial networks, may provide some interesting solutions to this issue. In task-based quality assessments, another challenge is that the traditional model observers are based on known statistical characteristics of the images. So that is why most of the studies that we could find used either phantom scans, particularly CT scans, or even computer simulated images. However, there is no evidence up to now that these studies conducted on simulated images can ensure a sufficient confidence to draw some relevant conclusions on real clinical data. Once again, deep learning methods could help addressing these limitations, as a task performance would provide a direct quality measure. So the challenge is to define exactly which tasks may be reliably delegated to a model observer that uses, for example, a convolutional neural network. So, as I said, to our knowledge, the existing models are still limited in terms of task range. For example, regarding characterization tasks, these tasks are highly complex and often involve a linguistic response. For example, either a tumor is benign or malignant. And other tasks that, for example, estimation tasks, which aim at determining a scalar or range of values for an object parameter, for example, a tumor diameter or the uptake of a radio tracer, for example. So these estimation tasks don't have studies that we could find up to now regarding image or video quality. And finally, looking into the future work challenges, the 3D visualization of medical content, for example, using stereoscopic or light field image, is opening now new opportunities, for example, in surgery training, as proposed by Martini et al. In 2013. However, the QA research on this field is still running behind the development of these imaging techniques. The compression and transmission of stereoscopic images as well as light field would require suitable metrics for the assessments of their performance. There have been a few studies, but not a lot. So Kara et al. Is an example of this type of studies in 2017. So future research might focus on evaluating the performance of already existing metrics for generic 3D images and videos and light field data on medical image. The availability of medical data sets is in stereoscopic and light field formats is, for that reason, in high demand for future research. So that's all from my side. If you have another question, I would be happy to take them. If you wish to discuss the paper offline, here is my email address, which will also be in the slides that I think were already uploaded to the VQEG website. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rafael. I think you can stop sharing your screen because we can see my face now. So does anyone have Any questions for? Yeah, Margaret, please.
So thank you for a very interesting presentation and valuable topics. From what you described, getting content is a major roadblock. Do you have any thoughts on how to improve that situation?
Well, the problem is always that some research centers and some researchers have the data. The problem is that these data refer and always have the problem of anonymizing the data, and sharing this data is always a problem because of that. So I think that's the main question that has to be addressed in the future. So VQEG group has been focusing on this. So we are currently trying to gather data and make that data available in a centralized website, for example, for people to access. But this will always be a problem because of the ethics institutions and that those kinds of things. So I don't see a solution for now other than keep pushing for people to try and solve those issues with the ethics boards of their institutions. I think that's the main problem that we have right now, and it's not easy to solve.
I'm thinking, as you raised the point, Margaret, maybe we could try I don't know, a call, like some kind of workshop or special session to try to get people to release their databases. I don't know.
We could put out a call. I don't know how likely it is to succeed for, say, law enforcement. I gave up. It was so difficult to get content out of law enforcement agencies that I filmed simulated content. And I don't know if that would be as easy to do here, but that might be worth investigating. Whether people would be willing to, funding's the problem, but would a medical research university be willing to conduct a project where that's the specific goal, is to create photographs that show problems they encounter.
Yeah.
And that it needs to be anonymized and shared with other researchers. Yeah. That's my only thought, but funding would be the roadblock, I think.
Yeah, I think so as well.
So far we found 3 supposed to be available datasets, but only 2 actually available datasets. Which is definitely
supposed to be, yeah.
So I've encountered that as well. Yeah.
Sorry, Margaret, I didn't hear you.
Sorry, I've encountered the problem as well, that a data set that's supposed to be available may not really be available when you go and try to download it. Yes, but I would very much appreciate, thank you for sending me any information you can. I'd like to analyze some medical data sets.
Yeah, sure. So Lou, Mariam, and I will make sure to send you the 2 data sets we found. Yeah, Mariam, go ahead, please. I saw you were raising.
Yeah, thank you, Lucy. I just want to add that it's difficult to explain the scope of quality to doctors because now you are a lot of databases that are available, for example, for COVID detection. But there is no database with associated mean opinion score or for example, also for task-based approach. There is no database available. So, yes, the problem is sometimes we cannot download the database. It's the case with our database, but it's okay now. Lucy did the test this morning with me, so we will have probably 2 data sets that we can propose, and we'll try through VQEG to raise this problem.
Yeah, and you always would have the problem of needing an expert in order to annotate these data sets. So some studies use both experts and naive observers, but more recently, most studies use only experts, as would be expected, because as I said, we are not only looking for a aesthetic evaluation of the content, but more importantly, the diagnostic quality of it.
Yeah. Yes, and we don't like naive observer, Raphael. We discussed about this earlier, and but now maybe we can explain more and more the necessity of evaluating the quality. We had some discussion with doctors last week, and yes, it was difficult to explain our topic, but I think that we will have some good results with him.
Good.
Another big main problem currently is that most medical professionals and healthcare professionals are extremely busy worldwide with the pandemic, as you probably know. So Maria, yes, please go ahead.
Yes, just to mention that, of course, they're busy, so it's not easy to get their opinions. But also, what we did when we collected the opinion scores for the medical doctors is actually we spent time in the hospital with them to collect the scores. So we cannot expect that they visit our labs to do the test, or so it's demanding in terms of time from the researchers' time, because we really again had to go to the hospital to meet them and to collect the scores.
Yes, and I just wanted to add that as I talked about using human in the loop systems, so maybe try to develop software that might collect an evaluation. I think that's most likely a task performance measure while the doctor is performing a diagnosis, and instead of having to perform a separate test. So but that would have to be thought about.
Yeah. So thank you, everyone. Do you have another question or comment following Raphael's talk? And otherwise, we can move on to Lou's presentation. So you should be able to see my screen now. So Lou wasn't sure whether she could be here. So we have a little video for a presentation. So it's actually a presentation she prepared for another workshop in which she advertised the QEG group. And so we thought it was fairly interesting to share this talk as a complement of Raphael's presentation, so on a task-based approach. So I hope you can hear well, so let's give it a try.
Hello everyone, I'm Lu Zhang from Isahan.
Can you confirm you get the sound of the video before we go?
Yeah, I can.
Okay. Thank you everyone, so I can play it now.
Today I will talk about model observers for the objective quality assessment of medical images. In this talk, we will focus on graphic images, which can be acquired from the acquisition of different image modalities such as CT, MRI, ultrasound, and so on. The medical videos such as daily surgery, endoscopy are out of the scope of this talk. So the end users here are radiologists, physicians, practitioners, and so on. Why do we need to assess the quality of medical images? Actually, with the development of the digital medical imaging, nowadays, radiologists face a lot of choice of different image systems, including acquisition systems, image post-processing systems, and the visualization systems. So medical experts may ask how to choose the right systems to ensure the image quality and ultimately the patient care. To answer the above question, there is a need for good measurements of medical image quality. You may know the traditional image quality metrics such as PSNR and MSE, which are based on the images themselves. But medical images provide image-based information for diagnosis or disease treatment. So medical image quality should be assessed not just on the images themselves, but on the performance of some tasks. So while it has been fully addressed by natural image quality assessment community, task-based approach are fundamental and popular in the context of medical imaging. The underlying paradigm is to quantify the quality of a particular image by its effectiveness with respect to its intended task. In this talk, we will focus on the diagnostic tasks, which can be divided into 3 subtasks in general: detection, localization, and characterization. The detection task simply requires the observer to find potential abnormalities. The localization task consists in indicating the location of each abnormality. The characterization task is related to the analysis of different elements of the abnormality and normally involves a linguistic response. So this is the most complicated task. In the framework of task-based approach, one or more diagnostic tasks can be performed by a panel of human observers, which are radiologists in our case. During the assessment process,
Lucy, you have to mute.
Oh, sorry.
Thus,
Good now?
the system that enables radiologists to gain a better task performance or to spend less time for interpretation with the same diagnostic reliability is said to be better. Since radiologists are the end users of medical images, the task performance of human observers is always the ultimate test of image quality. However, the assessment methods using human observers requires the time-consuming and expensive efforts of radiologists. Besides, variance exists between and within radiologists' responses. That's why there is a growing demand for numerical observers, which are mathematical models. Concerning the objective methods, the key problem here lies in modeling the diagnostic task process of radiologists by a model observer. Once the model observer performs approximately medical experts, it can evaluate different medical imaging systems using the same paradigm as the assessment methods using human observers. So today we will firstly introduce some model observers for different tasks. And then we will look at some fields of merit, which can be used to characterize the performance of different tasks. Then we present 2 examples of validation experiments using human observers in the context of task-based approach. At the end, we will introduce some recent works on MO approximation using artificial neural networks. Then we finish the presentation with a conclusion and some perspectives. So firstly, let's look at the simplest task, detection of one signal on 2D images. This problem can actually be seen as the validation of one of the 2 exclusive hypotheses, H0 signal absent, H1 signal present. Note that here, the G is the input image, which will be represented by a column vector with a size of m times 1. So basically, every model observer computes a scalar test statistics lambda g via a discriminant function of the input image g, and they differ by their discriminant functions. Then a decision is made in favor of hypothesis H1 if the test statistic is greater than a decision criteria lambda c. Otherwise, the hypothesis H0 is selected. In order to have some analytical expressions for the model observers, normally we also need to model the signal X and the background B. In the literatures, we can find the different simulated backgrounds. For example, here I list the white Gaussian background, the correlated Gaussian background, the lumpy background, and the clustered lumpy background. Note that homogeneous background may be realistic in some cases, for example, in mammography. But it is not realistic for brain MR images where radiologists normally view images in their entirety. So it's not a small homogeneous region. But we can still extract some white matter region from MR images. So to approach the real backgrounds, there is a selection of background model that depends on our modality, which is one important context of the task. For the signal model, the mostly used model is the 2D elliptical Gaussian function. For example, we can use it to simulate multiple sclerosis lesions. Here is a simulated lesion, and here are some real multiple sclerosis regions. So we see that the appearance is similar. So another context of the task is the pathology. So we need also to model the signal differently, face to different pathology. According to our knowledge about the parameters of the signal, the model observers can be divided into two categories: signal known exactly, SKE model observers, and signal known statistically, SKS model observers. For the SKE model observers, the signal attributes parameters such as the intensity, amplitude, size, shape, orientation, and location are exactly known by observers and do not vary throughout the entire experiment. And for the SKS model observers, the signal parameters is not known exactly, but specified by a probability density function. In this table, we have the three most famous SKE model observers. The first one is the ideal observer, which needs the full knowledge of the probability density function of the image for each hypothesis. Its test statistic is the likelihood ratio. But there are two main disadvantages of the IO. The first one is that its discriminant function is not linear. The second one is the PDF are often high dimensional, so difficult to compute for some real clinical data. That's why Hotelling observer HO has been proposed, which needs only the first and the second order statistics of the image.
Lucy, the mic.
Written as a scalar product of a template W and the G. The disadvantage is that the HO needs the inverted ensemble covariance matrix of the image, which is actually hard to calculate in the face of modern image high dimensionality. So that's why the channelized HO-CHO has been proposed, which only needs the first and second order statistics of the channelized image for each hypothesis. The discriminant function is still linear, and the dimensionality problem has been solved by the channelization technique. The channelization is actually a technique that decomposes an image into different spatial frequency and orientation channels by a series of filters. So normally the number of filters P is much smaller than the size of the input image G, which is denoted by M. Then all the calculations are executed on this channelized data, which is denoted by prime hereafter. In practice, the implementation of the CHO can be regarded as two steps. In the first step, a template W will be calculated based on some training images. Half of them will be lesion absent, half of them will be lesion present. And then we apply the template on the tested image to get the test statistic. As for the signal no statistical model observers, there are much fewer works compared to the SKE model observers. We will just take the CGO as an example. The idea behind the channelized joint observer is that the estimates of the signal parameters alpha and the hypothesis H are chosen jointly to maximize the joint posterior probability. CGO is designed for unknown signal amplitude, orientation, and size. The advantage of CGO is that its practical implementation is similar to that of the CHO. So it can still be divided into two steps. In the first step, we still use the training images to get the template. But for the CGO, we will also need to generate a reference signal. And we apply them on the tested image to get the test statistics as well as the parameter estimates. Now we will look at the detection and the localization task of one signal on 2D images. Among different approaches, the scanning CHO is the most popular method, which scans the image exhaustively. And the location that gives the largest test statistic is chosen as the tentative location, while that test statistic is the final test statistic. As for the detection and the localization task of multiple signals on 2D images, you can imagine we can still use the scanning model observers. For example, on this image, the scanning model observer can give an output like this. This is a characterization, but actually for an incomplete reason, because we actually have 3 abnormalities here, but only 1 was detected. Another problem is that the scanning model observers only consider small homogeneous regions. But here, when we look at the MR images, we have the entire cerebral image. So we will lose a lot of anatomical information. That's why the perceptually relevant CGO has been proposed. The underlying paradigm consists in dividing the diagnostic process into 2 steps. The first step is a global search to locate the abnormality candidates, which deserve further check based on some human vision functioning. So here we use the VDP, which is a human visual system HVS model, to select the candidate blocks. And the second step is a cognitive analysis and interpretation of each candidate meaning depending on the radiologist's knowledge and past experience. And this leads to their final decision. So the PCGO actually greatly extends the range of reliable signal parameters by extending the SKS model observers. And it addresses the difficulty of multiple signal localization problem using a HVS model. The last task will be the detection and localization task of multiple signals on 3D images. Actually, for numerous modalities such as MRI, CT, radiologists normally view all image slices of a stack, which is a volumetric image, in their entirety by scrolling back and forth. Compared to single slice images, volumetric image provides more atomic information, which allows for a better distinction between true lesions and the noise or background structures. So for these more clinically relevant tasks, there are several model observers which are extensions of the CHO. The first one is called single slide CHO, which is the most direct and simplest approach. It just uses a conventional 2D CHO and applies it on the central slice of a 3D stack. So it does not incorporate information about signal contrast in the Z direction or the spatial correlation of the background and signal in the adjacent slices. The second one is called volumetric CHO or VCHO. Since the CHO is not limited by the dimensionality of the problem by definition, a straightforward approach is just to extend the 2D CHO to 3D CHO. But we will use 3D image, 3D signals, and 3D channels. However, the VCHO is only useful when the 3D image data is not huge. If not, the related calculations will not be manageable. The third way to extend the CHO is the multi-slide CHO, which assumes that human interprets the multi-slide image in a two-stage process. Firstly, the image is processed in planar views, so XY plane, slice after slice, and the scores forming a vector obtained for each slice are buffered. Then in the second stage, the score vector is processed in the Z direction to result in the stack test statistic. Here we list the three types of MSCHOs which process differently the channelized images. In the first case, the template is calculated from the corresponding slice in the training image. In the second case, the template is calculated from the central slice of the training images. In the third case, column vectors are obtained from the channelized training images, and then the 2D HO template is applied directly on the column vectors generated from the test images. However, these extensions of CHO perform only SKE detection task. They can only detect symmetrical signals, and the signal is always located at the center. So to be more clinically relevant, we can imagine that we can also extend the PCGO to multi-slice case, which is called MS-PCGO, which consists of two steps as the PCGO. In the first candidate selection step, we will find the centers of 3D lesions and output blocks of lesions on their central slice. So we can still have some 2D test blocks. Then the second step is the same as the PCGO. We just apply the 2D CGO on the candidates to calculate a test statistic to each test block. After introducing the different model observers, now we need a quantity to characterize the task performance. This quantity is called a figure of merit. So we have different figures of merit for different tasks. For the detection task, we have the receiver operating characteristics curves, the ROC curve. So once we have the gold standard and the model observers or human observers response, we can use the criterion to divide the response into 4 classes: true positive, for negative, and true negative. By varying the criterion settings, we can plot the true positive rate against the false positive rate. The area under the ROC curve is said to be AUC, which can be a figure of merit for the detection. The higher the AUC value is, the better the performance is. So the AUC can be used to measure the distance between a particular model observer and radiologist performance. Once there is no significant difference between the performance of a model observer and the performance of human observer, we can see that the model observer is validated. And then we can use it to benchmark different imaging systems. So on our example, the system 1 with a higher AUC value is said to be better. As for the detection and localization task, it should be noted that the localization task concerns a proximity criterion in the presence of a lesion according to the gold standard. The proximity criterion could be an acceptance radius if the lesion is small, or a percentage overlap of the outlying region and the true lesion. So what constitutes the proximity criterion is a clinical decision that should be decided on the basis of the clinical application. So when the lesion is small, we use the acceptance radius, and the definitions of true positive and false positive will change. We will actually look at the distance between the marked coordinates and the true coordinates. If it is smaller than an acceptance radius, we say that the response is true positive. Otherwise, it is false positive. And if the marked confidence rate is greater than a decision criterion, the response is regarded as positive. Otherwise, it is regarded as negative. In the case where there is only one signal on an image, we can use the ROC curve, localization ROC curve, which is the fraction of positive true positive marks out of the number of actual positive images versus the fraction of positive false positive marks out of the number of actual negative images. If we have multiple lesions on an image, we can use the ROC curve, which is the fraction of positive true positive marks out of the total numbers of lesions versus the number of highest rated positive for positive marks divided by the total number of test images. Until now, it is shown that the ROC has the highest statistic power for detection and the localization task. Now we have the model observers. We know which figures of merit can help us to characterize their performance. We still need to do some validation experiments using human observers. Here is an example of the detection and the localization task on 2D images, where we can ask the radiologist to localize the center of the lesions by the cursor, and they can also associate a confidence rating here for each lesion. And during the experiments, he can also hide the marks or rates to get a clearer vision on the image. The second example is a validation study of the detection localization task on 3D images. we can see the radiologists can scroll back and forth just as they do in their daily routine. And then they can find the central slides of the lesion to locate it and mark their confidence rating. So now he found another lesion, try to locate on the central slide and assign confidence rate. Now we will look at some recent works about model observer approximation using artificial neural networks. We all know that the deep neural networks become very popular since 2012, but actually the application of neural networks in this domain dates back to 2001. Just as the used neural network is small at that moment. And recently, we also have some works to approximate the model observers for the detection task and detection localization task since 2019. The basic idea behind these models is actually to learn the empirical estimate of the hoteling template. So it can also be used to solve the high dimensionality problem of hoteling observers instead of using the channelization technique that we mentioned before. And here the localization task is still addressed by using the scanning model observer paradigm. However, there are still some open questions. I think that would be very interesting to do some comparison study between the CHO and the ANN approximated HO to compare their efficiency and the effectiveness. And the ANN approximated model observers have only been tested on simulated images. It will also be interesting to look at their performance on real images. Some conclusions. Actually, model observers have been proposed not to substitute medical experts, but to predict their performance in order to quantify or evaluate medical imaging systems. So MO studies should have some relevance for clinical tasks of interest. That's why we should use medical experts for the validation instead of some naive observers. And we also have to consider some important context impact factors, such as the pathology and the modality, which should be adapted for the started task. In addition, the expertise of radiologists will also influence the results. What can we do in the future? Actually, model observers have already been used in many applications, such as compression algorithms or denoising algorithms. But we can still search for more applications. And we can also look at more modalities because today most model observers are still tested on simulated images. They have been developed for MRI images, CT images, and so on. We may need more background models to approach some other modalities, and we can also consider the influence of colors. The last thing is that the current model observers are still limited by the range of tasks. As we mentioned before, we can only find model observers proposed for detection and localization task in the diagnostic task. No model observer has been proposed for the characterization task, for example. And we can actually also extend the task-based approaches for the segmentation task, surgery task, and so on. Last but not least, if you also work in this domain and you want to exchange information or work together on some common goals, do not hesitate to join us. We have a working group about quality assessment for health applications in VQEG. So you can subscribe yourself by sending an email to this address or go to the website of VQEG or just contact me. Thank you for your attention.
So I don't know about you guys, but I did learn a lot with Lou's presentation. So does anyone have any question or comment? Lou is here with us, so she can answer the questions and participate in the discussion.
Thank you, Lucy.
I don't see any raised hands. It might need some time to assimilate all these interesting informations. So yeah, still a lot of work to be done in medical imaging on model observers, and big need for datasets, subjective datasets. As Lou mentioned at the end of her presentation, also, if you are interested to join us, feel free to contact us. So either Lou, myself, or Mariam as chairs of this group. No question, no comment.
Maybe I will just complement a little bit. The model observer is still largely used and recommended. We have an example with the Canon company in the USA when they recently when they wanted to propose a new CT reconstruction algorithm. Actually, the FDA asked them to compare their algorithm with some state-of-the-art algorithms using the model observer. So even the FDA suggests usage of this.
Thanks, Lou. So I guess that's it for the QH session, except if someone has another comment. Shall I give back the hand to Margaret or Shell, maybe?
So thank you. So I believe our next presentation is in the AVHD project number 220 by Cosman and, excuse me, Abinu?
Yeah,
Sorry,
that's right.
I know that's not the correct pronunciation.
No, that's basically correct. Yeah.
Ah, okay, thank you. So please go ahead.
Yes. Okay,
All right, we're going to be doing this presentation together. Albina's going to be driving the slides and take over the second half of it. I'll kind of give a little intro at the beginning. This work actually started out of some conversations that Johannes and I had in the sidetrack of the VQEG meeting last December, actually, interestingly enough, during the presentation on the VMAF anti-hacking features. So that led to some discussions on the side about, is there more we could do to reduce the complexity of VMAF by changing some of the features. And today we're going to be talking to you about what we found along that journey, where we are today, and some of the things that we're going to be doing next. This is some work that required quite a few people. I've been now myself over here, along with some other collaborators from Facebook, Cindy, Johannes, Afar. So this is, we can go to the next slide. All right, so really quick overview of VMAF. I won't go into too much detail, just the aspects of VMAF that are relevant to the work that we did over here, as probably most of the people here are already familiar with it. VMAF, of course, is a fusion method using multiple component metrics. And we're going to be looking today exactly how we can change some of those underlying metrics in order to hopefully preserve most of the same performance, maybe improve it, and reduce the total operations required to get a good quality score. The individual components that we're going to care about are going to be DLM, also known as detail loss metric, which came out of ADM, and then VIF. We'll talk about motion a little bit as well, although that one's the cheapest part of VMAF and not super interesting by itself. So let's look at a high level of the computational complexity of VMAF. VIF is computed on a 4-level Gaussian pyramid, and it's probably the most expensive metric in VMAF. It uses Gaussian filters that range from 13 to 17 taps in size, so it gets quite expensive. It also uses some of the same Gaussian filters for the local statistics, and motion also tends to use some of the same similar blurring, although it uses a smaller 5-step Gaussian filter. And like I said, we'll talk about motion separately. DLM also uses a multi-scale method. It uses a 4-level wavelet decomposition using DB2. So this is what the problem that kind of Ioannis had posed at the last VQEG meeting. Given that DLM and VIF are both multi-scale methods and they both use a pyramid, if you think about it, it's somewhat unfortunate that they both use different pyramids that require, doing a lot of work twice. Would it be possible to combine both of these into the same pyramid? And technically speaking, we could consider either moving DLM onto a Gaussian pyramid or moving VIF over to a wavelet domain, right? This is the problem that was posed. And we've done some research on this topic. And what we found, go ahead, is that we can, it's definitely possible. So let's go into a little bit of detail on DLM because it'll be relevant. DLM works by using a wavelet transform. Like I mentioned, the DB2, it does a decoupling of separating out the additive impairments from the detail losses, which is actually interesting in and of itself, although not super relevant here. And Z talked about this at the VQEG meeting a year ago. It also applies then a contrast sensitivity function for which it uses subband weighting, which I'll touch upon in a minute. And then it uses contract masking with the expectation that the detail losses and the additive impairments essentially are masking one another. And the final result of this is the DLM metric. The original paper actually computes 2 metrics, both the detail loss and additive impairments. VMAP only uses the detail loss metric, and it seems to be a very powerful feature. In our findings, probably the single most powerful feature in VMAP. So I mentioned the CSF function, and this will be relevant in a little bit, so I'll just touch upon it here. The way the CSF is approximated in DLM is using subband weighting. And there's actually 2 different methods of doing this weighting. The original one that was in the paper and what VMAP actually uses today, which essentially work the same way, they just use different weights. The original one was based on some estimations on the nominal frequency for each subband, and then some expectations of the visibility. And the VMAP one uses some numbers that came from some empirical experiments using a different wavelet, using a CDF97 wavelet. But the weights seem to work reasonably well. So in all cases, basically for every subband of the final pyramid, there's a certain weight, and all the coefficients are multiplied by that weight. And like I said, we'll touch upon later on why that's relevant, but I wanted to kind of give that background here. So VIF uses the Gaussian pyramid as mentioned, but actually the original VIF was actually defined in the wavelet domain. It used a steerable pyramid decomposition. It was also very expensive because it used the vector GSM, and then it ended up being fairly impractical, I think, to actually compute it, which is why in practice almost everybody is using the pixel domain approximation of it, which is actually gave up the vector GSM for a scalar GSM, and it uses the Gaussian pyramid. But what's interesting is, like I mentioned, is that VIF could be done in the wavelet domain. Of course, the original wavelet wouldn't really help us, and it'd be more expensive. But it turns out there's existing work in this space that has already looked at using VIF on simpler wavelets. So it turns out that VFTWT, which is proposed back in 2013, as a possible replacement for VIF using dyadic wavelets. And it turns out that when using this, when the computer runs, say, a DB2 wavelet, the coefficients are decorrelated, so we no longer need the expensive vector GSM that was needed for the cerebral pyramid decomposition, where there's quite a lot of correlation across the subbands. The VFTWT computes essentially 2 different metrics. It computes one on what it calls the edge subband, which is a combination of horizontal, vertical, and diagonal subbands. We combine them all together into a single edge subband and compute the score there, and computes a separate one on the approximation subband. The actual computations themselves look essentially exactly like the pixel domain version of VIF, using local statistics on these individual subbands. And it turns out that in practice, it seems to work pretty well. And more importantly, it allows us to share the wavelet with DLM. The other insight we had at this point is, what if we could actually simplify the wavelet itself as well? It turns out that both VFTWT and the original paper for DLM mentioned that the metrics would work equally well, at least, using a simpler hard wavelet. You don't actually need the DB2 wavelet. The only reason DLM used a DB2 wavelet, according to the paper, is to avoid any false impressions that the blocky nature of the hard wavelet would somehow impact the metric negatively. So they use it just for convenience. From a computational complexity point of view, we could use the simpler hard wavelet. Likewise, in VQWT, they actually found that a hard wavelet actually works best. So this suggested that we could also change the wavelet while we're at it. And this is where the CSF function became interesting, and this is where the collaboration with Abhinav became super important, which is why I'm talking about it next. Essentially, if we change the wavelet, now we have to start thinking about, are the subband weights we're using for the CSF really appropriate? The original ones in VIF, the original ones in DLM, maybe we could argue might make sense because they're not really wavelet specific. They're kind of more about the nominal frequency for each subband. But the ones used in VMAF came from an actual experiment on CDF97. They seem to translate fairly well to DB2. Do they really hold when we go to HAR? And having replicated some of those experiments internally, it doesn't seem like experimentally they hold. Like using some of the same weights, which would expect noise to no longer be visible, actually is visible. So then the question became, what should the correct CSF be? And this is where, you know, the problem quickly required professional help. And this is fortunately where Abhinav stepped in and actually took this work a lot further. So I'll hand it over to him to tell you more about where it went from here.
Okay, thanks, Cosmin. So as Cosmin mentioned, the CSF function quickly became one of the central aspects of this project. And so I do want to spend a little bit of time giving some background on how we arrived at different ideas for the CSF and later on how the results turn out. So to do this, let's revisit the detail loss metric. This is a flowchart that we flashed earlier, just briefly explaining what the detail loss metric looks like. And it turns out that if you look at the math that goes into the detail loss metric, under any subband weighting mechanism, which is what is used in DLM, you can swap the order of the CSF and decoupling. So this seemingly simple change can now allow us to reinterpret what DLM actually does, right? So when you put the CSF before the decoupling and you draw this sort of imaginary line between the CSF and the decoupling steps, now it looks like you're taking the wavelet transform and applying the CSF as a sort of pre-processing step. And then you're applying quality assessment, which would be your decoupling and contrast masking and the final algebraic pooling methods to get a quality score. So with this idea, we can now think about how to introduce the CSF to other algorithms possibly, right? If the CSF is a good preprocessing step for DLM, maybe it's useful for the other algorithms that go into VMAF as well. And we call this idea a shared CSF because essentially you are still applying the CSF before DLM. The only question is, do you apply it before everything or do you just apply it before DLM alone, right? In terms of computational complexity, there is no added cost to sharing the CSF between all the algorithms. So, and the function of this preprocessing step is to account for the human visual system, which is what the CSF does. And this brings us to a sort of central question that we try to answer, which is how can you apply the CSF and what's the right way to do it? Right? Obviously, the subband weighting is a pretty simple and straightforward way to do it, and it's been pretty useful. But even the CSF weights that were used in the original DLM paper, which came from a particular model of the CSF, they use nominal frequencies for each subband. But as we know, if you pick any common wavelet decomposition, like the Haar wavelets or the Dobeshay wavelets, the central frequency of the subband is just not a good representation of all the frequencies that exist in that subband, because these subbands generally tend to have greater spread in the frequency domain. So using just one frequency is a bit too coarse, at least it seems that way. So, okay, if that's the case, then how else can we apply it? Well, the CSF nominally is defined in the frequency domain, right? Usually they come out of experiments with sine wave gratings that are displayed with different frequencies and different contrast levels. So it seems that applying a CSF in the frequency domain is probably the best way to do it, right? It is closest to the source and the original intent of the CSF. Equivalently, because we know some amount of linear systems theory, we can find an appropriate spatial filter that does the same thing and can avoid going into the frequency domain and coming out. So just to put all of that together, we've identified 3 ways of applying CSFs. The first is the original subband weighting in the wavelet domain, which takes an input image, you compute a wavelet transform, and you multiply the coefficients in each subband by their appropriate weights. It's pretty straightforward, right? The second option is to do it in the frequency domain, where you start with an input image, you take an FFT to get the frequency spectrum, you multiply pointwise by the CSF defined in the frequency domain, and then you take an inverse Fourier transform to get the filtered image, and finally you take a wavelet transform for the algorithm, for the quality assessment algorithm. Finally, you can combine this FFT, pointwise multiplication, and IFFT into one step where you have a CSF that is represented by a spatial filter. And you directly convolve the input image with this CSF, and you get your filtered image, following which you can do a wavelet transform. Just as a very quick note, because wavelet transforms themselves involve filters, there is scope for merging the CSF spatial kernel with the first level of the wavelet transform, so that rather than doing 2 filter ops, you could do 1 filter op. It may or may not be a big factor depending on how you want to implement this, but it's still worth keeping in mind if it's of interest to anyone. So, okay, given that there are 3 ways of applying CSF, what are the actual CSF methods that we considered in our experiments? The first 2 are the 2 subband weighting methods that come from the original DLM paper that we're calling Lee's weights after the authors of the DLM paper, and the Watson weights that come from Watson's experiments, which are used in VMAF. Other than that, we want to also consider frequency domain filtering, and the model of the CSF that we used was the same model that was used to define the Lee weights. Given that the Lee's weights perform pretty well for DLM, this felt like a natural choice. Finally, we considered spatial CSF filtering. And to do this, we looked at the CSF function that was used in the frequency domain, and we calculated an analytical inverse Fourier transform to actually get the spatial domain version. It turns out that because the frequency CSF is defined in a continuous frequency domain, when we convert it to the spatial domain, we get a continuous filter as well, which we have to then sample. A point to note here is that the sampling density is actually proportional to the ratio of the distance to height, which means that if the distance to height ratio increases, you have to sample more densely and your filter sizes become larger, which could affect computational complexity. For now, we chose the ratio of the viewing distance to screen height to be 3.0, just as VMAF does, to keep it consistent. But maybe if you want to apply this to mobile applications, then the D by H ratio is typically higher, around like 4.5, maybe even 5. So just to visualize the CSF functions, on the left you have the frequency domain CSF that is used, that is also used to get the Lee's weights, and you have this typical bandpass nature with a peak around 4 cycles per degree and falling off on both sides. And in the spatial domain you have this symmetric spatial filter. Now, because this is an infinite filter, on top of sampling, you also have to truncate it, right? Because in practice, you're never going to use an infinite filter. So the question is, where do you truncate it? We consider 2 possible truncations. One is called a 1% truncation, and the other is a 5% truncation. And this percentage value basically expresses this tail value as a function of, as a ratio of the peak. So this value is in absolute values, it's 5% of the peak, and this is 1%. We tested both, and we found that the 1% truncation didn't necessarily perform much better. So we stuck with a 5% truncation, which comes out to a 21 tap filter. As we'll discuss in the algorithms going forward, this is probably the only expensive filtering operation that you have to do in the entire algorithm. And even this, if you insist on it, you could skip, and you could still see a benefit based on our other findings. With that covered, I'll just quickly go over the 2 other atom features that show up in our experiments. The first is what we call enhanced SIM. This comes from work that we did back in 2020, where we proposed a variant of SIM that we called enhanced SIM. And we found that it significantly outperforms the standard structural similarity index. The main features of enhanced SIM are as follows. We downsample images by a factor of 2 before applying quality assessment. The factor of 2 itself comes from certain calculations which arise out of this idea called the self-adaptive scale transform, or SAST. For our choices of distance to height ratio of 3.0, it turns out to be a factor of 2, but it can be calculated for any arbitrary viewing condition. On top of that, we found that using box filters, like that, also called rectangular or square windows, performs better than Gaussian filters, which are typically what are used for SSIM. And finally, we used coefficient of variation as the method for spatial pooling rather than simply taking the average. The coefficient of variation is the ratio of the standard deviation to the mean, and it has been shown to perform well for other quality metrics in the past. The idea is that when we look at videos or images, we're more sensitive to variations in quality than we are to the absolute quality itself, even though the absolute quality does matter to some extent. If you look at VMAF itself, SIM is not included, presumably because it hurts performance, as we observed as well. But we found that using enhanced SIM actually improved performance pretty significantly. I'll show you the numbers later regarding the use of enhanced SIM. But right here, one thing to note is that enhanced SIM, as it's defined, is defined in the spatial domain, right? And one of the main goals of this project was to combine as much computation as we can, especially by using the wavelet transform, by computing the wavelet transform once and using it for everything else, right? So it's a bit aesthetically not pleasing to have to do one algorithm in the spatial domain and everything else in the wavelet domain. And also by not considering the wavelet coefficients, you might be missing out on some amount of compute that you can save, right? It turns out that if you use a Haar wavelet, you can actually compute spatial domain sim from the wavelet coefficients. And I want to clarify this to avoid any misunderstandings, that we don't define sim in the wavelet domain, right? This sim is exactly the same as it would be had you calculated it in the spatial domain, but we're able to use the Haar coefficients to do these computations differently. That's it, right? There's a little bit of math that goes into showing that this can be done, but the intuition is that the structure and the properties of the Haar transform specifically are what allow us to do it. Right? If you use the Daubechier wavelet, you can still carry out these same computations, which we will do, but the properties don't necessarily hold, right? When I say structure, what I mean is that because a Haar transform uses a two-tap filter and it also performs dyadic downsampling at every level, the Haar transform of the full image actually consists of tiny little Haar transforms of its patches, right? So if we can make certain claims about the properties of Haar transforms, then those claims also extend to the patch level for appropriately chosen patches, of course. So just to visualize this, I've shown a one-dimensional Haar transform here of an original sequence, and the coefficients shown in these dotted lines, they are the Haar transform coefficients. And these 4 red coefficients actually constitute the Haar transform of the first half of the signal. And the 4 green coefficients constitute the Haar transform of the second half of the signal. And then appealing to the orthogonality of the Haar transform and some energy preservation properties, we can show that we can get local statistics like local means, local covariances, and local variances directly from the Haar coefficients. So this is good because it allows us to compute sim using the same wavelet coefficients that we want to use for WIF and DLM. Finally, I'll just touch on the one last feature, which is the motion feature. It's the mean absolute difference between successive low-pass filtered frames. Right? In VMAF, as you will recall, a 5-tap Gaussian filter is used for low-pass filtering. But because we're computing a wavelet transform, the approximation subband itself is basically a low-pass filtered version. It doesn't use the Gaussian filter. There's an appropriate filter that's used, but ultimately it is still low-pass filtered. So for convenience, we simply define motion as the MAD between approximation subbands. So in this way, we're able to do one wavelet decomposition and then use it for all of our quality models. So just to recap quickly all the candidate features that we considered, we have wavelet domain sim with coefficient of variation pooling, which is the proxy for enhanced sim. Then we have wavelet domain sim with mean pooling. We have WIF, which is the original formulation using a vector GSM model. We have a scalar version of this where we do use the entire wavelet transform, but we replace the vector WIF alone with a scalar WIF. Sorry, a vector GSM with a scalar GSM. And then we have this WIF DWT, which is the alternate formulation that Cosmin spoke about. We can also define scalar WIF features on the approximation subbands. So if you will recall, the WIF features that are used in VMAF, they are basically computed in a Gaussian pyramid, right? And if you collect the approximation subbands at each level of the wavelet transform, that is also a pyramid of successively low-pass filtered versions of the image. So you can compute scalar WIF on these approximation subbands themselves. Finally, we have DLM and motion as well. So I'll go to the experiments. The experiments that we conducted were pretty extensive. So I'll give you a brief overview of what the setup was like. So we start by defining a configuration, which we call a combination of a choice of wavelet, so either Haar or Daubechier 2, the number of wavelets, number of wavelet levels, sorry, 1, 2, or 3, the CSF method that is supposed to be used, and whether or not you apply SAST, which is whether or not you downsample the video or the image before applying any quality assessment. We identify the best feature set for each configuration using random cross-validation on a training data set. And then we test this across data sets on 7 other data sets. So all the models are trained only on one data set and they tested on the other 7. The best configuration is determined based on the average test set performance, and we'll show you some of the best configurations that we found. During our experiments, we considered performance in terms of the linear correlation, also called the Pearson's correlation, or the Spearman-Rank order correlation coefficient, which measures monotonicity, and the RMSE. To keep things simple, I'll only show you SRCC values, but if someone's interested in the PCC values, I can always go back and find them. the experimental methodology that we used was actually adopted by this very interesting work from BBI and Netflix from 2020. I think even Z and Lukash, who I'm not sure if they're in the meeting today, but they're actually part of this work, which is great work. And the experimental methodology was basically adopted by this because it was very thorough. So in their work, they trained two models, M1 and M2, which are we essentially trained in the same way, but on two different databases. M1 is trained on a private Netflix database, and M2 is trained on the same training database that we had access to. And what we're calling enhanced VMAF, which is their work, is a combination of these two models. So because they had access to this private Netflix database and we don't, we thought it would be fair to look at M2 as one of our baselines. And we also thought it would be fair to retrain the baseline VMAF model, so VMAF version 0.6.1, just retraining it on the training dataset that we have available. In this way, we'll be able to eliminate the let's say the added benefit of having a high quality private database for training. And we wanted to see if that actually made a difference. So these are the baseline models that we have. We have the retrained version of VMAF version 0.6.1. We have the original version just off the shelf from the official release. We have M1 and M2 of enhanced VMAF and the model that's put together. And as you can see, retaining the model does severely decrease its average performance in the case of VMAF version 0.6.1. And similarly, M2 performs worse than M1 and the combination, right? So it shows that there is a lot of merit in using the private database. And for our purposes, we will focus on the retrained versions, even though we do perform better even than the baseline VMAF itself. These are the top 5 models that we identified based on our experiments. It's a lot of numbers and it's a lot of details here, but the takeaway that I really want to focus on are the first 2 models, right, which on average perform almost identically, but the second model in this list does not use WIF at all, right? While the first model uses WIF from 2 scales on the approximation subbands. Another thing to note is that all the models on this list use COV pooling, which is enhanced SIM, which is what we would have liked. And of course, they all use DLM. There is absolutely no reason to not use DLM. It performs incredibly well. So the fact that we have a model in the top 2 that doesn't use WIF tells us that we can skip expensive computations of like logarithms in hardware or any vector GSM models and things like that, right? Which is, I think, a very useful finding because it can be pretty expensive to do at scale. While the COV pooled SSIM is very cheap. You just do like 2 or 3 convolutions, which, when you're using square windows, you can actually do away with convolutions as well. And you have these very simple operations that seem to perform quite well by adding other features together. One piece of information that's been omitted from this table, sort of conspicuously, is the idea of sharing CSFs, right? And the reason it's been omitted from this table is because all of the best models share their CSFs. So which is why I didn't find it worth mentioning here. In fact, if I had to pick a model that did not share the CSF, I would have to choose a model probably like the 20th best model, something along those lines. So it's really no contest that if you have the option to share your CSF, you should do it, right? So even though it has been mentioned here, that's one of the bigger findings of our work, which is that there's simply no reason not to share your CSFs across all your features. Interestingly, the performance of individual features, so if you look at WIF for SIM, gets worse if you include CSFs, right? Which is not something that you would expect, because if I'm going on and on about how great it is to share CSFs, you would expect, okay, just pick any algorithm and add a CSF and it gets better. But in fact, that doesn't happen. What does happen is that when you put the features together, they're able to perform better together rather than performing better individually. And a final comparison between the models that we find and the baseline models. If you look at the retrained version of VMAF, which is one of, I think, the most important baselines, the average performance is 0.8. Our best model is closer to 0.87, which is a significant improvement over the baseline. Even enhanced VMAF and M2, they achieve 0.86, and we're achieving similar performance, but we use significantly fewer features, and we're sharing a lot of computation. So in terms of the computational complexity, we are still much cheaper. Flashing 5 models at you is nice, but it's useful to get a deeper understanding for what's going on, really, right? And the way we do that is we borrow this idea of ablation testing, which is pretty common in deep learning, where we look at the pieces that we're adding and we try to find out how much each of them affects performance. Right. So to do this, we first exclude what we consider impractical models. Right. Like theoretically, certain features may be of interest, but in practice, they would never be used. And one easy example of this is the frequency domain CSF filtering, because you simply don't want to be taking FFTs and IFFTs for every frame for a video or for HD videos. That's just not practical. So we excluded all the models that used frequency domain CSF filtering. And then we considered three options that we would either turn on or off. Right? So the first thing that we want to consider is whether we want to allow spatial domain CSF filtering or not. Recall that this 21 tab filter is probably the only expensive filtering operations that you will have to do in all of this algorithm. So being able to turn it off can be a big computational benefit, right? So we want to see what happens if we can turn it on or off. The other idea that we introduced was this COV pooling for SSIM, basically using enhanced SSIM, and we want to see if that improves performance or not. So we have an option to turn that on or off. And finally, we could choose to exclude all VIF features or only exclude vector VIF features. In other words, we either retain scalar VIF or we exclude all VIF. The reason that we always exclude vector VIF is because you simply don't want to be computing inverses of 9x9 matrices at every frame. That's just not practical again. So we exclude all of them, and we choose to either keep scalar VIFs or not. The reason that we are interested in this is because VIF uses logarithms, and especially in hardware implementations, you may not want to do that at every frame. So it's useful to know what happens. So with that in mind, I want to visualize the performance of restricted models on an axis that shows the average test SROCC. From left to right, it's increasing in performance. Just before we get into each of these individual models, what I want to show you is that all of these models seem to appear in pairs. Right? You see these 4 pairs of models, and all of these pairs correspond to whether or not you allow VIF. So it seems that even when you restrict the kind of things that you can do, whether or not you include VIF doesn't seem to affect the average SROCC much. Sometimes it's a little bit better, sometimes it's a little bit worse. It's not obvious, but it's not significantly one way or the other. So okay, with that in mind, let's go over the models from in the order of most restrictive to least restrictive. So when we say most restrictive, what I mean is that you're not allowed to apply a spatial CSF, you're not allowed to do COV pooling, and you're not allowed to use any VIF features. If you disable all that, your feature set is basically fixed. You use a mean pooled SSIM, use DLM in motion, right? Even the most restricted model, which achieves an average SOCC of 0.83, performs better than the baseline retrained VMAF, which achieved 0.8. So even if you do very little, just by virtue of sharing your CSFs, you can do better than the baseline, right? Aside from the computational benefits. If you allow VIF, the performance doesn't change much, as I mentioned. So you don't necessarily have to use VIF all the time. The next step that we can take is to say, okay, what if I allow spatial CSF alone, right? Let me not do anything else, but just include the spatial CSF. So now you're doing one expensive filter op, right? And this gets you roughly halfway between the most restricted models and the least restricted models. And you, again, with or without VIF, the performance doesn't change too much, right? The other interesting thing that we observed is that, let's say you don't use spatial CSF, but you only allow using enhanced SIM, which is the COV pooling, right? That itself gets you about halfway, maybe even a little bit further than the CSF, right? So even if you feel that a 21 tab filter is too expensive for you, simply by changing the pooling method that is used in SSIM, you can get pretty much the same benefit as if you had used the CSF or even the spatial CSF or more, right? This is a great thing because COV pooling doesn't really incur much computational cost. It is slightly more expensive than the mean pooling, but hardly anything. So again, with or without VIF, it doesn't really make a difference. And finally, if you just allow everything, you see the top 2 models that we found, which both perform almost the same with and without VIF. And here you allow both CSF, spatial domain CSF filtering and COV pooling. These are all the models that I showed on the axis in case someone wants to go back and look at the exact numbers for each database and the specifications. I went through these takeaways very briefly. So what we're showing is that unified VMAF can outperform the baseline VMAF, likely at a significantly lower cost, computational cost. And I say likely because we haven't shown numbers of exact timing analysis. but the argument that we're making is that if you pick any step that is done in VMAF, we're doing it cheaper, except for spatial CSF filtering, right? But still, even if you turn off spatial filtering, spatial CSF filtering, as we saw, you can still get a pretty good performance compared to the baseline. So it's pretty certain that we will incur a much lower computational cost. The other big takeaway is that sharing is caring. As I mentioned, it is sort of hidden in the tables, but all of the best models share their CSFs. And so, if you want to join the cool kids, you should probably do that as well. The only non-trivial convolution that we're doing that we may have to do is the spatial CSF filtering. Yeah, again, it's not mandatory, but it's probably a good idea. And we found that spatial CSF filtering and COV pooling, aside from the shared CSF, are the main drivers of performance. And individually, they contribute to roughly 50% of the total improvement that we saw. Finally, I glossed over this, but the best feature set that you identify can vary depending on whether you focus on any individual data set or the average performance across 7 data sets, or you start including restrictions on which features you want to include or not, right? But the idea is that there's a common theme that underlies all of these findings, which is what I had mentioned earlier regarding the filtering and the pooling and sharing CSFs. It's a very quick recap of what we've said. So what are the features of unified VMAF that we're proposing? We want to use a unified transform. So we conduct one wavelet decomposition and reuse that wavelet pyramid for all the quality models. We want to use a unified preprocessing step, which is to perform CSF-based filtering prior to all quality assessment. We want to avoid convolutions wherever possible. So I say wherever possible because of CSF filtering. But other than that, all of the convolutions within the quality models have actually been replaced by square filters and integral images. So they're no longer really convolutions. Finally, because we're able to get away with skipping WIF, we can avoid logarithms, which may be expensive in hardware. Reusing the data in this way and avoiding repetitive filtering will likely significantly reduce computational complexity. And yeah, applying the CSF to all the quality models incorporates properties of the human visual system. I think that's the end of the talk, and happy to take any questions.
Saman?
Yeah, thank you very much. It was a very interesting presentation. I have a question about your evaluation. So you're using SR OCC, so Spearman correlation, I guess.
Right.
At least in most of the analysis, I see it. I remember there was a work from Babak from my previous group, and he was showing that there is a quite somehow noise could be seen that when you're using any rank correlation. And the reason for that is that you have a confidence interval, and this confidence interval in the most that you have will decide for you actually slightly your correlation could go up and down, and especially when you go up to between 0.8 to 0.9, it could be just simply by chance that your mean value when this confidence interval could mislead your result. I'm not questioning if the result is correct or not.
I understand.
But I think something would be very nice is to take into account this confidence interval, one thing, and then also having more evaluation metrics like PLCC. I know that VMAF doesn't need to be linearly correlate with the subjective data, but it's still, I think it's a good indication, to have that. Even you can remap that and have a look into the data. But there's a nice paper about that. If you want, I can share with you. There's also one way to transform the most scores in a way that can take into account such a confidence interval that you don't have such a high rank and then play an important role in that. So I think that's an important thing to look into it. But in general, It was an interesting presentation. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Okay, I have a few questions around your training databases.
Yeah.
And my first one, this is just my own curiosity. Of the 5 publicly available VQEG HD TV data sets, VQEG HD3 is by far the most often downloaded from CDVL. What do you like about it? Why did you use this one and not the other 4?
Yeah, so the reason we chose these databases was because it was used in this enhancing VMAF work from Netflix. Because initially we were using the Netflix public and the VQEG HD3 databases because they were used in the VMAF release. But then along the way, we found this paper, which had a much more comprehensive evaluation. And so we just looked at the set of databases that they used, and we chose whatever we could publicly get our hands on. That was the rationale behind this set of databases.
Okay. And of those other, sorry, was there something else you wanted to say?
No, that's it. Go on, please.
I was going to add, I think really we're using VQEG 3 because, VMAF and therefore Netflix is sort of essentially recommending it. Like currently in the VMAF documentation, it's one of the recommended databases to use. So along with Netflix Public, and then also used over here. So I don't know if Z's still on, but it'd be interesting to hear from him about like why VQEG 3 and not the other ones, because honestly, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, if there's anyone else listening who has an answer, I am really curious about that one. Would it be possible for you to put into the minutes a link for each one of these data sets?
Yeah, sure. I can find them. I don't have them on hand, but I can definitely go back and look for these. Yeah.
And
I think I have most of those with the exception of SHVC. SHVC isn't publicly available.
Yes.
So that one we can't link, but the other ones I should have links for.
Okay, great.
Okay, and I'm curious, which do you find to be the most valuable data sets and which are the more recent ones? I noticed that the Netflix Public you had very high performance on, but it wasn't clear if you were emphasizing that data set because it's more relevant, if it's an easier data set, just it wasn't clear why that's happening. Do you have any thoughts?
Do you mean why the performance is so high on Netflix Public?
Yes.
We didn't try to optimize for performance on any one of the databases. What we optimized for was the average performance on all 7. And the hope was that, the previous commenter mentioned, sorry, I didn't catch their name, but they said that by chance you could do better on one of the other databases, right? So the hope was that if you average out on all 7, that effect can be minimized. And so the high performance on Netflix Public is a consequence of probably the content in the database rather than any of our efforts to do well on that database.
Okay, thank you. And David?
Yeah, thanks. And thank you for the presentation. Very interesting. We can stay on this this page, I think. So you chose the feature set based on the training data set. And then did you do validation individually on the rest of them without retraining or anything, or feature selection or something?
Right. So we found the feature set by cross-validation and then retrained on the entire training data set to get a trained model. And then we simply tested them on the 7 data sets.
So those 7 data sets were never, what do you call it? They were never part of the training or feature selection or anything. Yeah, that's good.
No.
But I mean, one could assume though that the Netflix database is based on or is what's used in training of VMAF, right?
Yes.
Not Netflix Public though. So this is where like basically Netflix Public is essentially a subset of I think what's in the Netflix private database, assuming probably the the public domain content parts that can be shared. Clearly, the Netflix private data set itself is very powerful, as Abhinav showed. Like VMAF itself, trained on just the public data set, performs significantly worse. The exact same features in 061, significantly worse than the VMAF trained on the secret Netflix data set. So clearly, there's a lot of power in the data set alone.
Yeah. No, I understand that. Yeah,
so I think for a final model that's going to be useful, this is where we're actually talking to the folks at Netflix about trying to get some help with this. Is like if we come up with some features which we think are very good, then getting those same features trained by Netflix on Netflix private data set and released as a model may perform better than anything we could train ourselves. So ultimately, I think the collaboration there will be very useful. Or alternatively, somebody maybe can put a lot of energy into creating an equivalently open data set that can rival the performance of the Netflix private in training really good generic models.
Yeah, thanks for the questions. Very, very informative.
Are there any other questions before we finish this talk? Well, thank you.
If there's no other questions, or while we wait for questions, I'll add a couple more points. So as you know, we kind of mentioned like SRC performance itself isn't sufficient to have a really good production quality model. And for example, we may find that when we evaluate other important metrics for a production model, like outlier ratio, that maybe, you know, VIF doesn't do much in terms of SRC, but when we add VIF, it significantly helps reducing the number of outliers. So that may be a reason to keep it, you know, potentially. So there's going to be some ongoing work over the next few months to actually try to take these findings of here are some features which should work well into now let's train an actual production usable model from it, and hopefully create something that can be used by anybody on any data set, much like VMAP is today. So hopefully by maybe the next VQEG session, we'll have some additional follow-ups on some production-ready models, and we may very well find that some features that were irrelevant SRC-wise may end up surviving the final cut.
Okay, thank you. And thank you both for a very interesting talk. It was very good to hear about what's been happening here.
Thank you.
So this is the last topic we had for today. And if there's no other topics raised in the raising of hands, I'd like to go through and approve the minutes. So hold on while I get down to the right starting point of today's notes. Okay, so please just interrupt me if you see something that needs to be changed. So we began with CGI, presentation 231. And thank you for putting these nice notes in here. We had some discussion from Yanis and David. Then we moved to the administration discussion. We had an offer from Lou and INSA in Rennes, France, to host a face-to-face meeting in spring 2022. And the key parts is that we'll be putting out a poll around attendance of a face-to-face meeting in spring, looking at 3 weeks to hold the meeting, whether it's face-to-face or online. And for online meetings, poll hours of the day. And I don't think we added that one to the time of day for online sessions, dates for spring meeting, and attendance of face-to-face, if still possible in spring. Were there any other topics we wanted to add to that doodle poll that I'm missing? Because I think that was everything. Okay, we had an agreement to close the joint Evergroup and the ILG. And I see a typo here. Then we had a presentation 237, a call for papers. And then moved to quality assessment for health applications, starting with presentation 227. And presentation 228, model observers for the objective quality assessment of medical images. And in AVHD, the topic we just discussed, the unified VMAF. Okay, I don't see anything that needs any changes. Are there any objections to approving the minutes? Hearing none, we will approve as written, noting that for the last topic of discussion, we may insert some notes on the data sets they trained on for future reference. And thank you very much. We will close this session and see you all tomorrow.
Okay, see you tomorrow. Thank you.